Thanks very much, Alan. It's really wonderful to be here. What glorious weather you have. No, it is a fantastic thing today. I mean, Nikita's presentation was a kind of rip-roaring sense of the possibility of these tools. And if you find it exhilarating, that's great. I think everyone also finds it somewhat frightening. It's a bit like being in a car and you're steaming down the highway and what do you call it? The gas pedal is kind of stuck to the floor and you're desperately trying to reach the brake to slow it down so that you can keep up with what's happening. And everywhere I go when I talk to newsrooms, that's the key feeling, is this sense of hurtling forwards and not always being in control. Where's my clicker? Pocket. As Alan said, I'm at the LSE, where I'm a prof in the Media and Communications department, but this is the project that I've been running for the last 6 years, Journalism AI. I'm going to talk about it later, but there's loads of resources that you can access there. We do training, but we also do lots of innovation work. We do this AI fellowship. We've got one of our fellows in the room. Hi. And this is teams of people working on AI challenges while they are working in newsrooms, and they collaborate with teams. What's it? Who's in your team?
I'm a newsroom from Norway and 2 journalists from the United States.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a lovely sort of collaborative effort, and they produce all sorts. They might produce prototypes, or they might produce just papers on the kind of challenge that they've been looking at. So again, really, really useful stuff. And we put it all together with an online festival at the end of the year. And what's clear over the last 6 years, actually, even before Gen AI, was that AI can help, partly as Nikita showed so brilliantly, in all sorts of ways. You know, creating an article is probably the least useful thing it can do. So it's really important that we have everyone from every aspect of news production, right through to news distribution, thinking about this and being part of any effort to integrate it into your news organization. So when I spoke to the Star yesterday, it was really wonderful that there were people from their legal team, from their marketing team, as well as from the different editorial teams. This AI should never just be left to the tech team or the tech person. It's something, as Nikita has shown, for everybody. And of course, again, as Nikita showed, we've had this incredible game-changing shift in the last 18 months with this explosion of new tools, but also an explosion of concerns around how you integrate this. How do you do it? What are the risks? What are the challenges? How might it change your journalism? So last year we did this big global survey of what news organizations around the world were thinking. We're a very global project. In fact, we have a deliberate emphasis away from places like Canada or the UK because we are trying to see what's happening in total and what impact it's having on the industry everywhere. The most obvious thing was that most newsrooms, when we surveyed them last summer, were using, or at least experimenting with generative AI. And that could just mean playing with it. Doesn't mean they were necessarily building anything or using it in anger. I'm always interested in the 1% here, was unclear. They didn't know if they had been experimenting or not. Slightly confused. And the other obvious point was that they were using it again throughout every aspect of news production. There's more of it than there was back in 2019 when we surveyed people. But again, it's still throughout the production process. And here's some of the use cases that people were doing with it. Mostly not, so there's some generating copy there. Mainly what Nikita was talking about, the analyzing data, and of course the data extraction and coding development being really important. And everyone said, again, not surprisingly, that they're going to use more of this. What was more interesting was the main areas that they thought it could be useful in doing. Things like fact-checking, a lot of attention around personalization, text summarization. Again, Nikita was showing loads of great ways to do that. And then things like using chatbots. And I think the chatbot one is a really interesting one because, yes, it's a groovy little kind of gimmicky tool that you can put on your website or your app or something. but it also does something quite interesting if you're a journalist. It tells you what your audience wants to find out. That's really interesting, isn't it? But you can tell by the questions that people ask what they're interested in. And that's quite a useful prompt to you to say, well, are we giving them the answers? Are we covering that? And shouldn't we be? So I think we can see how AI is a really useful tool, but it's also perhaps changing the way you do your journalism and giving you kind of new capacity. Lots of challenges, not surprising. I think these are all similar things that people would have said about the challenge of any digital development, social media and so on. The managerial one's always interesting. I think that means my boss isn't on board. Then there's the cultural challenges, and these are really important. People have been through a lot of changes over the last 10, 15 years. And I think a lot of journalists are just thinking, oh my God, here we go again. I'm going to have to attend loads of training workshops. I'm going to have to work differently. I'm going to have to try and understand this newfangled stuff. It's going to mean I have to work harder in the end. It always does. And I'm really badly paid. So I think I can understand those challenges. And also because we've seen so many journalistic articles about how evil this stuff is, that a lot of journalists quite rightly are saying, oh, that sounds like the devil's work. I'm not going to touch it. It's these nasty tech companies. And they're not wrong entirely. And that's partly about the ethical challenges, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But obviously the biggest one is simply the technical and financial constraint. Have you got the time to do this? Is there anybody in your newsroom who understands it? But as Nikita said, the key thing about Gen AI is it's the low barrier to entry. It's so accessible. Anybody in your news organization can start to prompt. They can start to find out what it's about. And again, that's so different to AI in the past. It's much more like social media that anybody can have a go. These are the kind of ethical concerns that people had. The most obvious one is that we don't know how it works. Even the people who build this stuff don't really know how it works in a measurable way. They don't know exactly how it arrives at those language predictions. I'm not saying it's magic. We understand the basic technology, but we don't know with the specific action that it takes. We cannot measure how it did it accurately. And that's kind of concerning if you're a journalist. You kind of want to know where that information came from. So people are worried about journalistic values, things like accountability and obviously accuracy. And people were also worried about more general things like the idea that this technology would encourage the commercialization of journalism, churning out kind of content farm material. And obviously misinformation. Clearly, this technology makes it much, much easier to generate propaganda and disinformation and hate speech and so on. And we can talk about that separately. But in the end, of course, you always have to remember that any disinformation you see has been originally created by a human being. AI doesn't wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to create some fake news. It's people who decide to use it to do that. So yes, there's an issue around trust. Reuters Institute published one of their surveys about what the public think about AI in journalism. I'm not sure how valuable it is because I don't think most journalists don't really understand what AI is doing in journalism. But obviously that's a really important aspect of how we use this tech. And then yes, there's this sense of being blown away by the pace of the development, but also the dependency on tech. And those of you who did the pivot to Facebook video a few years ago, and then Facebook decided it wasn't interested in your news video anymore about a year later, will know that in practice, this is a real hazard. You can use these tools that Nikita talked us about, but what when they suddenly change the tool, or what when they suddenly double the subscription, or it suddenly becomes unreliable, etc. So that's always a hazard around this. And finally, the sustainability challenge. And by that, I don't mean the environmental bit, although that is an aspect of AI that's a negative. But it's more this idea that we're all battling to survive. We're trying to have a business model that keeps our journalism alive and thriving, and this is another threat. Why would you bother going to your news website when I can just go to one of these generative AI tools? And you all need to think about the answers to that question. I've got loads of reasons, but you have to come up with your own. And clearly, as I said, it can be used to do really stupid things. Sports Illustrated, which is now owned by new people who are hopefully not so stupid, you're probably familiar with this example where they used Gen AI to create a load of articles. It was kind of reviews of, I think, of sort of sporting equipment and stuff, kind of product reviews. And it was full of mistakes. The Gen AI just wasn't very good at doing an accurate, truthful review of the product. But worse than that, they pretended that the articles had been written by human beings. So all these people were generated by Gen AI. They don't exist. They're not real people. So it was kind of double ethical screw-up. Not only were they creating unreliable, false content, but they were lying about it. And they were pretending that it was real content. And I think that's, the most important thing is to be transparent about your usage of it. And also, just as Nikita said, don't use it for a lot of things, but certainly be transparent and call on more transparency from the tech companies as well as the newsrooms. Definitely build guidelines generally that include the ethical element. And there are some fascinating guidelines out there that you can relate to. Some of them are like 50 pages long, BBC. Some are just a few bullet points. But having the guidelines is really helpful. It's helpful for your journalists to feel more confident about using AI. It's also good for your public to know that you're thinking about it. They think, okay, these guys have got a real policy about it. But also the process of actually drawing up the guidelines is really useful. Having that conversation within the newsroom, what worries you about this? What do you think the risk is? What do you think the good use might be? How should we do this? That in itself is a really useful project. Adopt the human in the loop approach, and by that it means don't just leave the AI running. Think about why you're adopting a certain tool or process, and then review it, edit it, just like you would. I like Nikita's metaphor about, what did you call it, the nervous intern or the underconfident? That's it, yeah. So it is like having an intern. They can be fantastic, but you wouldn't leave them alone. You would monitor them. In fact, you wouldn't leave any journalist alone, frankly. And then this last idea of collaboration, which I'm going to keep going on about. Don't try and do it on your own. Don't try and reinvent the wheel. Talk to other people in your business, but also talk to universities and other folks. So generally, AI journalism is about understanding the tech. Of course it is. But it's like any other journalism. It works best when it's vetted properly, when you're rigorous about your use of it, when you're thinking about the reader all the time. Of course, you have to be truthful. And as I said, underpinning this is having a kind of transparent approach. And those are all human decisions. You can do all those things to make sure that your use of AI is credible. Very quickly, just thinking more broadly about risks. Sorry. Thinking more generally about, is that on? Yep. There are the general risks that apply to using AI in any situation. And to be honest, I think I'm more concerned about the use of AI in things like the military or in recruitment or in medicine or in welfare systems, for example. I think it can cause a lot more damage in that than it can cause damage in journalism. But we are aware that they have discrimination built in, and there are those big legal issues around copyright and, of course, regulation as well. Then there are the more general risks for the news media as a sector. I've mentioned tech dependency, but perhaps the biggest one, as I said, is this, the posh word for it is disintermediation. And I'm surprised on my jet lag that I can still say that. But this idea, as I said, why would anybody come to you when they can go directly via Gen AI to get their information or to do their informational work? And then there are those specific journalism risks that we talked about, the threat of inaccuracy, the threat to the business model, and also a threat to quality. There's always going to be this temptation, we know this, that we become lazy. You know, we over-rely on these tools. You know, it's easy for people like me or Nikita to say, you know, double-check all these things, but the temptation is not to. We know this already. When we use agency copy, we just use the copy, don't we? We don't necessarily think about checking it. But I think the biggest danger, I think, when I go around talking to newsrooms is this idea of missing out. Because it is going to be inevitable. It's going to be part of all our working lives. It doesn't matter what sector you're in. So you need to be across it. You also need to be across it, you know, because the world we're living in generally, and that you're supposed to be reporting on as journalists, is going to be using it. But also, the bad guys, if you like, and your competitors will definitely be using it. They already are. The people who don't care about the ethics, they don't care about the safeguards, they are already using Gen AI to churn out, inverted commas, journalism. So if you want to retain your place in the sort of info sphere, then you've got to start using it. And there are things you can do. First of all, you can do things as an industry to address some of these ethical concerns. You know, you can block the large language models from using your content to train, or you can negotiate with the Gen AI companies. I think the Atlantic magazine, I think today, has just announced that it's done a deal, I think with OpenAI, where they're going to get paid to allow controlled usage of some of their content. You can draw up your own guidelines, but also industry-wide guidelines. I was part of this Charter for AI in Journalism process with Reporters Without Borders, where they try to sort of, you know, draw up a nice, optimistic, idealistic set of standards for using AI. And then, again, Nikita was ahead of me on this, increasing AI literacy in the industry, reforming journalism training, and as I say, collaborating with just about anybody, universities, startups, even the tech companies. And there are huge gains to be had here. You've seen how, you know, the kind of whiz magic of some of these tools, but perhaps, you know, the key first gain is going to be around efficiency, the idea that you will be able to work faster and do more thanks to these tools. But also this idea that the tools can empower you as a journalist. You know, when you're watching Nikita's presentation, surely you're thinking, wow, I would like to be able to use that because I could actually do more interesting research and I could be more creative and thoughtful about the way that I actually create the content as well. Things like translation, for example, has got so much better. I travel around the world and, you know, a lot of people do not speak English, strangely. You know, the country like South Africa, where they've got whatever it is, 12 official languages in one country. So the idea of translation that can be instantaneous and reliable is really interesting in a business sense, as well as, for example, in a news gathering sense. There's going to be new products and new services, things like chatbots, things like personalization, and there will be new ways to actually counter the same disinformation and propaganda that might be created using AI as well. But the key one for me is this last one. This is my sort of optimistic hope for AI. And of course, this is a strategic choice that will be made within your news organizations. But surely, you know, if this AI can do a lot of that routine, repetitive, banal labor that we all know is part of our journalism. You know, when I worked in television especially, about 60–70% of my time was doing basic kind of admin stuff, you know, just organizing the tech to make the journalism happen. So if it can do that, then surely the opportunities to do what I would call more human journalism. And by human, I mean things like investigations. AI doesn't wake up in the morning and say, I must investigate, you know, this local scandal. You have to do that as a human being. That's a moral decision. The specialism, you can become much more specialist around your particular topic. And again, that's a human thing where you're making connections. And the AI can be really helpful in you doing that, but in the end, that's a human quality. And just the idea of human interest reporting. AI not only does not know the truth of anything, but it has no interest, it has no curiosity, it has no compassion, it has no sense of, wow, that's weird, let's report on it. It has no idea of serendipity, no idea of empathy. It doesn't care about what's happening, of course. And finally, that AI can't go out into the streets of Toronto and find things out and talk to people and witness what is happening. That idea of being present when something is happening in the world. All those things are human things, and I think they are going to be the thing that makes your journalism stand out in a world where there's going to be so much more artificially generated content. So I think it's a business thing. And be ambitious about it as well. This is one of the proposals by one of the fellowship teams for this year. And it's hugely ambitious. And I personally don't think they're going to be able to achieve this. Fact-checking is difficult enough, but the idea that you can do it in real time, live on video or audio broadcasts, I think is a really complicated technically, but also complicated editorially and so on. But it's a fantastic team. And just a side note, if you look at the people as part of this, I've achieved something that the United Nations would envy. I've managed to bring together the Murdoch's News UK with the BBC to work on something together. They're also working with DPA, the German news agency, and interestingly, this great outfit called Data Critica, a digital investigative journalism team based in Mexico. So it's just a wonderful group of people, and they're going to have a lot of fun, I think, doing that. And then, as I mentioned, there's these new journalism products we'd be thinking. And this is a really interesting one. I don't know if you know Sophia Smith-Gaylor, but she's an incredibly talented person, ex-BBC, then went to Vice, and she's now freelance. She writes books and was huge, or is huge, on TikTok. But she's immediately taken to AI. And this is just her as an individual. She has already built something where you can use a tool, a Gen AI tool, to write viral video scripts, which are based on her very, very successful viral video scripts. So the possibilities are huge, that big fact-checking thing, or just something very personal and specific like that. How do you do this? These are my sort of 6 steps towards an AI strategy. It's very funny, when we first did the survey back in 2018 of what people were doing with AI, one of the things we asked them, we said, do you have an AI strategy? And my favourite reply to that was, listen, mate, we don't have a strategy for anything. We're a news organisation, So I understand, it doesn't have to be a sort of very sophisticated thing, but it's these steps, which is, first of all, get yourself informed. And by that, I just mean have some basic understanding of AI and, of course, generative AI, as I say, because you're going to be using it, but also the world you're going to be reporting on, it's going to be present in that. So you have to know something about it, and your colleagues are going to be using it. Then this idea of AI literacy, and the difference between that is, it's not just knowing a bit about it, it's knowing what you can do with it and what you can't do with it. That's what it really means. And again, that's really important for anybody using these tools, partly because the advantages that we've seen this morning, but also the hazards, the things that you can get wrong. Assign responsibility. And this can mean, you say, okay, you're the AI person now, and then you think, oh, that's the job done. We've got somebody in the organisation who's going to find out about this and solve it all for us. Well, that's a first step, but of course that person should then be utterly networked into the rest of the organisation, and there's got to be a process. And you do it how you want. It can be through your team meetings, or it can be through a digital or AI sort of working party, that kind of thing. But I think that is so important, that because this is so fast changing, it's not just good enough to send everyone on a training module and then leave it. It's a continual process of keeping across what's happening out there and thinking through where can you use it in your organisation Who would be responsible for it? What difference might it make? How do you measure return on investment? And that's the fourth bit, really, which is, start testing this, start using it, start experimenting with it, and then think again, did it work? Was it useful? Should we generalize the use of it? Drawing up guidelines, I think, is vital. I'm not a big guideline guy. I worked at the BBC for 10 years, and I don't think I ever looked at the producer guidelines of the BBC. You kind of knew what was right and what was wrong. But I think with this one, because it's so novel and unstable, I think it's important to do the process of guidelines, at least. And then finally, I keep saying this, but collaborate and network. And it is changing so quickly. This was just a couple of weeks ago, wasn't it, when Google announced new AI-powered search, which wasn't entirely successful, and the OpenAI GPTX 4.0, which is exponentially better than what was there before. And you've probably seen these demonstration videos where people are waving iPhones around. It's doing all sorts of translation and interpreting images and stuff. Obviously, they are hype videos, but they're also incredibly impressive. And if they're only 30% accurate or usable, that's still quite a leap. I'm going to end on just a very quick advertisement. These are some of the things that we can do to help you with that process. We run this journalism AI discovery course. We run it at set times in the year. We've just done a Spanish version of it, and I think we're going to be doing a Arabic version of it later in the year and an English version later in the year. And it's basically a kind of email module course that you get weekly with a Slack channel so you can talk to the other people taking it. The English version that we did last year had more than, I think it was like 3,000 or 4,000 people from more than 100 countries around the world took the course last time. So that's good fun. There's an AI starter pack, which is basically a very sophisticated Google document where you can go, explore AI for yourself, and it will take you into all sorts of different resources and so on and information. We have a huge Airtable of case studies. These take you to articles about where people are using AI in newsrooms. So if you want to, find out a specific use case, you can go and search that, and you can see what other people have tried to do with AI. And then finally, you can join our newsletter. We've got about 11,000 people signed up to that. It's kind of monthly newsletter, so it's not going to fill your inbox. And we've also got something called Journalism AI Connect, which is basically a Slack channel where you can talk to other people who are using AI in journalism. So thank you very, very much.
So we have a few minutes for some questions, and I'll start passing the microphone around. You can pass it to each other. I'll try to get another one going also.
Hi, Charlie.
Hi,
Patrick from the Globe and Mail. There's been a couple of devices released recently, the AI Pen from Humane and the Rabbit R1 AI device, which have both been reviewed to be duds.
Right.
Do you see much of a future for AI dedicated devices versus just having apps on your phone, or it just becomes part of our existing technology?
Yeah, that is an interesting part of it. I mean, my work is sort of generally kind of the future of news kind of stuff. And I think that one of the important things about AI is that it's going to lead to this more structured news system. So instead of thinking about the article or the film, you are going to be thinking about just the flow of content and how it flows through your AI systems, and it goes into different formats and all that kind of stuff. And so in that sense, I do think that offers incredible opportunities to deliver journalism in lots of different ways, lots of different formats, short, long, video, audio, automated largely. And so I do wonder what that means for the app in particular, but also, frankly, the phone. That means you can send this structured journalism into other devices. At the moment, I agree with you. I think they're, pretty meaningless, But it's kind of, what is it called, the Internet of Things. I do think that especially with journalism, one of the challenges is that, one of the advantages of journalism is we have done the packaging for you. We've done the sifting and filtering. And if you trust us, you will come to us to do a lot of that process. And the question is how much AI is going to replace the news organisation in doing that. And that does mean it could free up the flow of information to other things, like, I don't know, Google Glasses and stuff. What's it called? The glasses, which the original ones were a dreadful idea, this idea that I could film you with my glasses. Only a tech company would think that's quite normal to do that, But the idea that you could get some sort of messaging off your phone, I think is interesting. But I think it's largely, again, I think that's kind of more the gimmicky end of this. It's a bit like the robot newsreaders, which have been around for a while, actually. I think it was a Chinese newsroom did this 4 or 5 years ago, even before the latest tech. And I sort of think, why would you do that? Because, I went into an American newsroom, and we were talking about virtual newsreaders. And one of them said, well, they're bloody robots anyway. I write the scripts, and they just sit there and read the thing. I might as well have a real robot that I don't have to get coffee for, and it's cheaper. But the whole point, I think, is that you want a real person. Even if it's somewhat an actor, you want a real person because it's real news. That's what you're saying. I do know people who've used it. There's a Czech company, for example, that uses the avatar of the real news presenter as the overnight presenter. And they're very clear about it. They say this is an avatar. They don't say it's her. But it does raise all sorts of interesting philosophical questions, about why you would do it. And I think that's really important. Again, Nikita showed the brilliant way that you can generate images. But of course, you don't want to do that if it's for a news piece. You don't want to say, I've generated an image of Justin Trudeau doing something today. You want the real picture because you're a news organisation. Now, you may use it for other use cases. You may use it to do, I don't know, sort of generic illustrations of things in the same way that you might use a stock photo. So I think there are clear cases where there are limits on the use of the tech.
So I had 3 or 4 hands up, so if we can try to keep it brisk, Janice and then Anava, and we'll work our way over here.
Okay, this isn't a brisk question. Janice Neal, I'm with Toronto Metropolitan University School of Journalism. As an educator, I'm wondering how you think about the question that's kind of existential about what knowledge is, what it is that we are teaching. I don't mean teaching our students how to use these tools. I mean what real knowledge is and how we assess it. In 30 seconds.
Yeah, right. There is the teaching thing later, but I know what you mean. I think there is, what do we really know? I remember when I was at Channel 4 News once, and I was doing a morning meeting, and I said, we're going to do this story. The Daily Mail have got this really good story, and we should be doing it. And there was this grumpy old Scottish reporter who said, but Charlie, how do you know that it's true? And I thought, he's right. Just because I read it in the Daily Mail does not make it true. And what he meant was, what are we going to do today to verify this and authenticate this? And I think as journalists, especially in broadcasting, but more generally, I think, we've become used to this idea that what we do as journalism is the truth, is real. Now, I don't think I don't worry about it in a sort of French philosophical way, about, post-truth, postmodernism, relativism way. But I do think we're too complacent. Truth to somebody out there can be quite different in the sense of what matters. So I think this is almost about agenda framing, deciding this is news, that isn't. As an editor for 10, 15 years, I would just sit there all day going, not news, news, not news, news, important news, not important news. And that was just a habit, and it was based on my cultural assumptions and my experience. And I hope we don't repeat that mistake with AI. I hope we use this to broaden our understanding of what people are interested in and what people think is the truth or real life. We keep talking about what's in real life and real people as if they're different to journalists. And the sad truth is they are, especially in the UK, but I think more generally, journalism is becoming increasingly undiverse. I don't mean in terms of ethnicity necessarily, or even gender, but in terms of our background, our education, and our interests. What we think is important. And I think the tech can often be really helpful. We did some collaboration and work on, for example, debiasing the news, in the terms of debiasing the human news? Why do you always use the same context? Why do you always do the same version of that story? You know, can you think differently? Can you use different sources, different people and so on? Can you think of a different narrative? And I find it really helpful. I find the Gen AI stuff really helpful in terms of, give me 6 ways of doing this story, say. You know, and that just gets you out of your safe place.
I'm going to suggest we get the remaining 3 questions on the floor, and Charlie will have a kind of a question buffet to test his jet lag memory. So,
Sure, who are the other ones?
Nanada beside you, and then the gentleman in front of you.
Okay. My question is about collaboration. I'm in the testing, playing kind of stage. What do you mean by collaboration?
By collaboration, I mean all sorts. So firstly, you start from the basis that journalists hate to collaborate. When I was a journalist, I didn't collaborate with anybody. I didn't even share my contacts with my colleagues, never mind with anybody else, because we were so rigorous and independent and competitive. So there's a very natural and I think virtuous thing about journalism thinking like that. You know, I work for the Toronto Star. You know, I'm proud to be a Star reporter, etc. So first of all, it's about collaboration internally, making sure that you, again, the editorial team will work with the marketing team. You're not supposed to do that. There's supposed to be a Chinese wall, but that's rubbish. If you're trying to personalize content for people because you want them to pay to subscribe to you, well, that's a marketing issue, but it's always also an editorial issue. So how you're going to use AI to do that has to be a conversation between all the, what do they call it, stakeholders. But then externally, one of the really interesting things about this collab fellowship we did, and it's all been, it wasn't a grand plan to do it, we just felt our way through, we just responded to what newsrooms were telling us would be useful. So we did this thing, and people said, yeah, I'd like to work with that team in Australia, or I'd like to work, okay, right, let's see how it goes. And we did research afterwards, we did very detailed, deep feedback on the process. And one of the things they said was that collaboration breeds collaboration. It's not easy to do. Collaboration is a lovely word. It's like community. Everyone's in favour of it, you know. But actually, you know, community can be poisonous. Collaboration can be really difficult, and it can be constraining. So you have to have a method, and we're very good at doing it. We can guide people really well at this now. But the benefits are greater than the parts. Is that the phrase? The sum is greater than the parts of collaboration. That you learn so much, you get shortcuts, but also you get this kind of freshness, especially with this one, because we're taking people away from their daily news work. Well, not literally, they stay there, they're coming remotely, but they're sort of getting out of their normal zone. And people are so worried about AI. You know, what's it going to do to my job? What's it going to do to my newsroom? Is it going to kill my brand? That it's quite a relief to get the fresh air of doing things like this, frankly. You know, this is what I mean. You know, collaborating with universities, collaborating with startups, talking to people in other industries, looking at how they are doing AI and where it works and where it doesn't, I think is really interesting.
Okay, so let's get the last 2 questions out before Charlie answers, and we'll...
Hi, Charlie. Angela from TMU again. My question, I have like 5 questions, but I'm going to ask the most important one. That is, I read over and over again about the hope and the hype of AI in journalism, in that it's going to free us up for all this other stuff. Have you run across any departments that are suddenly so free and they have all this investigative time? Or is it just being loaded with other things? Like, is the AI actually giving us free time to do the important, creative, human journalistic work?
Okay, and this gentleman here has a question. And then we'll let Charlie answer, and then we'll...
Hi there, Rignum from CBC. My question is about the deals that newsrooms are signing with these
Right.
AI companies like OpenAI. It seems like the latest shiny object, and you know, it's no secret a lot of newsrooms are struggling, and you know, this is seen as a lifeboat. It can be seen as a lifeboat, kind of like what social media back in the day happened. Do you view it that way in terms of these licensing deals? And are there alternatives to this reality in terms of these seem like kind of short-term wins when these companies are going to take all this data and then kind of be done with it afterwards and discard these companies? Is there another way, perhaps like where, you know, we're able to get paid every time, you know, a result comes onto the AI kind of tool, as opposed to just getting paid for licensing the data? You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
Because yeah, so I'm
No,
just
I've already
wondering
got
other
what you're
different
talking
ways.
about. I mean, you obviously know as much about this as I do. My my thought about it is actually, this is the depressing bit. I hate it when people ask this question because I actually think the answer is quite depressing, or at least it's challenging. Yeah, challenging, that's the nice word. Because I think I've talked about the competitive threat that goes via this technology. And it's very much like the internet. When the internet came along, suddenly it was marvelous that I could now read the Toronto Star and the New York Times sitting in London. But it also meant that, as we know, the competition then becomes greater and you lose the advertising. The advertising being lost is a separate thing. And we've got to get away from this, the tech companies stole our advertising. No, they didn't. You never owned it in the first place. It was just a wonderful coincidence that my brilliant journalism at Channel 4 News was funded by advertising. And do you know what it wasn't actually? One of the things I learned from the advertising people at Channel 4 News was they said, you're costing us £20 million a year because nobody wants to advertise around your programme. If we were to put a soap opera there, we'd get far more. I think there's this myth that journalism, hard news anyway, is in itself valuable commercially. It's not. It's always been subsidised. It's always been about people having a habit of news consumption, enjoying the news consumption, and yes, finding it informationally useful. So I think this starting point that we have, I think that journalism is somehow a national park. That's where we've got to now, where we're saying journalism is a national park and should be funded. And tech companies, they've got a lot of money, and they are doing things. I mean, I absolutely agree with challenging them on their appropriating our data, using it for training, etc., etc. And then if you're, especially in imagery, there's definitely a case for copyright violations and so on. But generally, in principle, what you're getting there is hush money, and I don't think it's viable. The only solution is to go back and ask yourself, why would anybody want to consume your journalism, and then build the appropriate model around it. And it's possible, subscriber model or the Guardian's membership model. The kind of journalism you have to do has to be focused on creating that bond, that relationship, that satisfaction for the audience. I don't think there is a real shortcut in terms of, you can, anything's possible. The Canadian government is doing all sorts of weird things in this field. It could say, the tech companies have to pay us an extra 5% tax and we're going to give it all to lovely mainstream news organisations. You can do that. That's possible. What was the first question?
The hope and hype. Where's the Brave New World?
Yeah, good question. And the answer to that is also a bit depressing. Partly because this is all new. It's amazing. We're sort of thinking that with Gen AI, which is, as I said, what is it, 18 months ago it happened. We're saying, well, has it transformed journalism yet? No, because quite rightly, people are being cautious about it. And it takes time to change these systems, So in that sense, it would be quite amazing if within 18 months, think about, the internet. It was invented, whatever it was, 1980. When was the first newspaper online? What? No. It was some weird paper in somewhere like Colorado or something. Went on in line in 1980 something. And of course, there was nobody there, but they did go online. It's kind of like the Columbia Dispatch or something. You can Google it for me. And it then took, I was at BBC in 97 when they did BBC Online. How long ago was that? And I then went to Channel 4 News, and they didn't even have a website, when I first joined them. It was quite extraordinary. So in the past, it's taken a long time, and that enables us to adapt, and also, frankly, to miss out. And this is happening so quickly. Where I think there's a really, I agree so much with what Nikita's presentation. It's so fantastic, these tools. But as she quite rightly pointed out, a lot of times you do it quicker yourself. It's a bit like with email. Email can add to your workload, can't it? Constant fucking emails from your bosses telling you about doing stuff, when you're trying to get on with your job. And often, those wonderful email chains when somebody could have just walked across the newsroom and had a conversation and sorted it. And it's the same with the AI. It's amazing, I can get it to do it. Yeah, but why do you want to do that? One example would be transcription. If you're doing a short 1 minute 30 piece for the news tonight, or just for the website or whatever, and you interview somebody, you don't spend an hour interviewing them. You just ask them 2 questions. and you're automatically in your ear, you're thinking, right, that's the one. And it's always the last one, of course, isn't it? It's always the last answer. So you don't need AI to do that for you. So I think there's a lot of, and this is what we're trying to work out, like everyone else is, this year. We're trying to see what is really working. How do you measure whether it's working? What's the, if you like, the return on investment, editorially or financially? And how replicable is that? How far can you spread that? Or is it just that one person doing that weird thing that they find it useful for? So the answer is, it's not a depressing answer, but it's saying, don't buy into the hype itself. It is incredible, but hype in the sense of, wow, we've made this tool, doesn't mean you have to use it. And so I'll do my last quick anecdote on this. I had a wonderful meeting with the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. Do you know about this? The AFZ, which is the most elite intellectual newspaper in the world. It's a newspaper that only about 10 years ago they decided to have photos on the front page. And I say the front page because it was mainly a newspaper back then. It was only 20 years ago they used to use Gothic font, and now they're much more sophisticated. And there's a fantastic team of people came to visit me at the LSE. We had a brilliant conversation about the tools that you can use and the different systems you can use, and the creative use cases, as well as the risks and so on. And they said, this is brilliant, Charlie, this is fantastic. We really, really appreciate you sharing all this with us. And I said, so what are you going to do? And they said, well, we'll probably wait a couple of years. We'll wait a couple of years and see how it settles down, and then we will probably start using some of this stuff. And they're in the very privileged and unusual position where they can, because they've got an incredibly loyal subscriber base. They're a kind of financial, intellectual newspaper. Their audience is not going to drift off to TikTok or to ChatGPT overnight. They don't have to worry about it. And I think there is a sense of, fools rush in. But at the moment, I detect the opposite problem. I visit even really good newsrooms, and there's a real sense of, St. Augustine, make me virtuous, but not yet, O Lord. It's kind of, yes, this is great. We are definitely looking at it, but they really are holding back. I understand why, but there's so much you can start to be doing and trying to get people. I'm not hyping this. I'm not an evangelist. I don't make money out of this. I'm a professor. I'm paid as a prof, not as a AI guy. And I think there is a leadership issue here around setting the right culture so people feel more comfortable around this and that they start to use it, not just because it's more efficient, but I honestly think that in the info world over the next 5-10 years, if you are not using these tools and systems, you're going to be like the person who hasn't got the website or has never been on social media. Good luck to you, but you are going to be left behind. And I know that sounds like a sort of tech bro thing, but I think it's true. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Charlie.